But George, just one that's just come in that actually has come in previously on a few other of these webinars is just around delinking and just that question around, is there anything tenants can do now? Is there anything specific in their tenants agreements, a clause, some words that they need to be looking at to understand whether they are going to be able to take the delink monies? Is it as easy as that, or is it more complex?
Yeah, so there are two separate issues here, Greg. There's the issue of delinking and there's the issue of lump sum payments. So DEFRA is considering the possibility of allowing individuals to make an annual claim for BPS without having to bring forward all the land data that we previously, that we have been doing up to now, so that the payment is simply made against the entitlement rather than having to link it to land. So that's the delinking aspect. DEFRA is also looking at the possibility of bringing forward the idea that you can cash in your BPS entitlements for a lump sum. We're expecting a consultation on that before the end of the year, possibly mid-December. And in most cases, it's fair to say that tenant farmers will have the entitlements in their own hands and will be able to make their own decisions about whether they wish to enter that lump sum scheme to take a lump sum payment. There will be some situations where if tenants are leasing entitlements from their landlords, or where they've entered into agreements which bind them in certain ways in terms of what they do with those entitlements, but they will need to look carefully at those agreements to make sure that there isn't anything which is going to trip them up. We're obviously talking to DEFRA about the scheme design of the lump sum scheme, so that even where we have situations where landlords might have got restrictive terms in tenancy agreements, we would want the scheme to override those. So notwithstanding what's in agreements, obviously that can't be guaranteed because we need to wait to see how the scheme develops. But certainly I would advise people just to have if they think they have entered into any sort of arrangement with the landlord, this will be principally on farm business tenancies, but some succession tenancies may have clauses which bind them in any way at all, to have a proper look at that before they enter into the scheme.
Right, thanks, George. Charles, just before I come to you, just one quick question that's come in. I'll just put to George. George, this is from Stafford. George, removal of the alternative commercial unit requirement is good news. What other tenant-related improvements have been achieved in the Ag Bill?
Okay, so the Agriculture Bill has got a Schedule 3, which contains various changes to agricultural tenancy legislation. So yeah, the biggest win is the removal of the commercial unit test, which said that a potential successor couldn't be an occupation of another commercial unit of agriculture, which, as you say, Stafford, is really good news. Other changes include the ability to use expert determination for rent review disputes. Previously, we could only go to arbitration for rent review disputes, but now we're able to go to third-party determination on that. We've got for county council smallholding estates, we've got the change in the retirement age, because county council smallholding estates, where there are retirement tenancies, require the tenant to give up the holding at 65, so long as the local authority provided suitable alternative accommodation. That now is going to be increased to the state retirement age going forward, which is good news. One of the other big issues is for AHA tenants, the ability for tenants to object to a landlord's unreasonable refusal to allow them access to an agri-environment or other form of government assistance scheme. And we're currently in discussions with DEFRA around how to put together a package of dispute resolution which will allow a tenant to use that facility. So yeah, some important changes there.
Right, thanks, George. Charles, can I pass over to you?
Sure. Good evening, Greg. George, good evening. That was interesting, and I haven't listened into any of your previous deliveries, so it was interesting to hear you running through some of those changes. And as per the question just asked by Stafford, I mean, one of the points I think that's concerning us in looking at the short to medium term future in agriculture and agricultural incomes, and around this livelihood test that we talk about for succession cases, is that if net farm incomes are going to be quite a lot thinner in this transition period until we see and understand exactly what's going to be provided by Elms, how does the livelihood test of a successor, how is it judged if indeed the holding can't support a farming family, of which there may be a son or daughter seeking to succeed the tenancy? Because I can see every likelihood of that happening, particularly over the next few years. And of course, some of us are old enough to have been around since the late 80s, early 90s, when we last saw quite a big change in farm incomes and some sustained difficult trading periods where tenants had a few difficulties, and there were quite a few deals done with landlords at that time. Of course, many things were different then, including land values, whereby either succession was being put forward or landlords were doing deals to allow tenants to give up holdings but stay in the house the rest of their lives, etc., rent-free. And I, foresee some quite difficult challenges coming for tenant farmers with this BPS erosion hitting their P&L directly. And I just wondered how this livelihood test in the new bill might be changed, or isn't it going to be changed, in your view?
So there's absolutely no change to the livelihood test. So you still have to show that you are earning your principal source of livelihood from farm work on the holding or a big unit in which that holding forms part for 5 out of the previous 7 years, as I said. However, the issue around supporting 2 families from a holding because you've got the principal farmer and the potential successor has been an issue for a long time. But there are things that can be looked at, and there's been tribunal cases which have assisted us in terms of planning for succession and livelihood. So it's not just all about income. So there are benefits in kind which accrue to a potential successor. So that could be the provision of accommodation, the provision of meals from the farm, a farm car, clothing, council tax, anything which the farm provides and pays for in return for that potential successor's farm work on the holding is considered livelihood. The other thing to bear in mind is that the potential successor can earn livelihood away from the holding, maybe contracting or in another job, but so long as they earmark the income that they're earning from that off-farm employment or off-farm work towards non-livelihood assets, like, for example, investing in a pension or in a mortgage for a house that they might live in retirement, or in stocks and shares, or in savings, then that doesn't fall as part of their livelihood. So you can differentiate between which bits of your income are used to spend on livelihood assets, like tins of beans and paying the electricity and running the car on the one hand, and what you are spending on non-livelihood assets. And we also had a very important case where people were taking money earned away from the holding and reinvesting it in the farm. So they were buying fixed equipment, buying machinery, buying capital for the business. And even though they were earning a shed load of money outside the business, they were able still to succeed because they were investing their income into the farm and taking a lower return from the farm as a result of that. So there's lots of ways of putting yourself into a position to be able to succeed. And bear in mind that we're only talking about half the livelihood, so you can still earn a substantial amount off the farm. And if it's a succession on death, you can go below 50%. So there are ways in which you can arrange these things so long as you plan for them in advance. I know that's a rather long answer, Greg, but I thought it was important to do that.
That's very helpful, yeah, and detailed. One of the things, George, that I think I'm concerned about is and what's your view, and where are we with the TFA at the moment in general, and the industry perhaps, as you mentioned right at the start, I think, the issue about rent reviews, and of course it depends where one is on that rent review journey at the moment. But I don't think there'll be many people that would disagree that we're not going to have some quite significant pressure on net farm incomes with BPS falling away, certainly through the transition period. Okay, lots of things at stake. How generous will Elms be, or won't it be? What trade deal is going to do to commodity price, etc. But I think the realistic view I would suggest is we're going to have some quite early pressure on farm incomes as BPS drops away. In terms of the sort of mood of the sector, I suppose, in terms of what you're seeing and what the TFA are starting to see, either about notices or about perhaps settlements, where long vision landlords are already engaging in the discussion about what are we going to do to ensure sustainable incomes for tenant farmers, and so they can be there for the long term to pay a sustainable rent. And there's some more discussion to have around that in a minute, but I just wondered if you've got a view on that in terms of where we are on that journey.
Yeah, so we have been taking the temperature of our members about the extent to which they would be interested in pushing the button for rent reviews. And we were certainly trying to encourage our members to begin to consider putting in notices this back end, where they had Michaelmas reviews, September, October reviews next year. What we were hearing from members was that they thought that was a bit too soon to be putting their head above the parapet. So we've had a few individuals serve notice for next year, but not as many as we would have hoped or liked to have served notice. We suspect that once we go over the top, and depending on what happens with the ongoing discussions between Michel Barnier and David Frost on the trade agreement between the UK and the EU, that we might see a number more tenants with spring reviews in 22 serving notice early part of next year for review in the following year. And we certainly will therefore see a bit more of a tsunami of notices coming towards the end of the year, if that's the situation. So we are certainly very much in the vanguard still at the moment, pressing people to look at serving notices. And unless you do serve a notice, you haven't got an opportunity to have that rent reviewed, and it has to be served a year in advance.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. It's been difficult, hasn't it, the last couple of years in terms of, as you say, not knowing precisely when the impact is going to fall. And of course, we've now had a very difficult season as well, and perhaps another repeated season 21 harvest, which might also encourage that debate. I think one of the things I've been talking about on previous surveys and sort of panel discussions we've had with farmers in general, but tenant farmers too, is although, you know, certainly throughout my working career, there's been plenty of competition, and you mentioned it in your presentation about bidding for CFAs, bidding for FBTs, and before FBTs, 495 bidding for AHA Act tenancies. And so there's been premiums paid, certainly in the past, over and above maybe the earning capacity of those holdings for a variety of different reasons. But I would say, I think we've seen that appetite has dulled somewhat already, but I think can maybe see a complete reversal of this supply and demand position as we start to see real focus and the need to really focus on what is the net earning capacity of a holding in terms of its ability to deliver profitable levels of return after all operating costs, because as we all know from all of us sort of farm businesses we're involved with, and there are some holdings and some land types and some rotational positions that really don't deliver any profit at all. And I think if the BPS isn't there, that's going to be much more out in the open to identify. So maybe we're going to see a complete reversal of lots of competition and perhaps overbidding for returns to landowners, whatever that return format might be, CFA, FBT, share farming, to perhaps finding it difficult to find operators for certain holdings at anything like the levels of return that we've been seeing in the past.
Yeah, I mean, the archetypal discussion that we sometimes have with people when they're looking at bidding on land, and they come, you know, they ask you a question about what do you think I should pay for this? What do you think I should put in for a tender for this? And obviously, it's very difficult to give them an answer off the cuff. So when you look through the data, I mean, let's say it's an arable operation, and it's, you know, it's a couple hundred acres of arable ground, and you say, well, you know, if you bid more than 120 pounds per acre, it's probably not going to make you any money. You're probably going to be losing money at that. And they say, well, I'm not going to get it for 120 pounds per acre. Why should I bother even putting in a bid? And my view is, well, if it means that much to you, you want to lose money on it, then certainly go and bid more than you think you can afford, because that's what you want to do. and invariably they come back and they say they bid 170, 180 or 200 pounds an acre for it, and then they might regret it, particularly in the past couple of years where we've had some really tough times. So I think there's still, I think I would agree with you, Charles. Whilst there has been a dulling of that over eagerness to overbid, I think there are still some people out there who are in that space. But the other thing I just think we need to be cautious about is that land is not only available to be used for farming purposes for an FBT. So the landlord will have other options, and certainly their agent will be talking to them about the other options available to them. And one of the issues that we're concerned about as we move into this new space is the extent to which landlords will have access to the new payment schemes that the government are bringing forward. Because we already see some landlords who are putting themselves into a position of getting themselves back into occupation, trading again in order to get some of the tax advantages, and looking at the possibility of taking grants for tree planting. We've seen that quite a lot in the north of England. Obviously, solar panels are still an issue that people are looking at as well. So there are alternative uses that I just think we need to be careful about in terms of the impact of driving rents down too far. You're probably surprised to hear me say that in terms of the tenanted sector. So I think we need to be looking at sustainable levels of rent that make give a sensible return to the landlord, but which don't cripple the business of the farmer when they take that opportunity. So I think there's a limit, and there are other competitive edges that we just need to be thinking about.
I agree with all that. I think had a quite a detailed call this morning on quite a substantial tract of land, or something. It was a substantial tract of land on exactly that subject. But equally, I think, and there are going to be different holdings and different landlords and different abilities to manage, isn't there? But I think custodianship of land and land management, as you say, it might be as extreme as solar panels and tree planting, perhaps, but other things that involve some sort of production or maybe some sort of stewardship scheme that requires a degree of management, a degree of understanding of the land, a degree of understanding of the public and the interaction with the public, some of which might be welcome on the land and some of which might not if they bring caravans and horses and things that stay for longer than they were intended. But so I think, yes, I'm sure you're right, but equally, I think from a landlord's perspective, farmers are good at farming and looking after land. It can't be done from an office, 100 miles away or via an agent necessarily or anything else. And I think that's perhaps the alternate play on that direction of travel. But I agree. I mean, if Elms was to come at generous levels and relative to crop production or production full stop, perhaps on certain land types, then that would be a danger, I suppose. And the tree planting issue, you touched on it briefly in terms of if we're going, and we've already got the woodland carbon guarantee scheme, obviously, and maybe we'll get some other sort of carbon guarantees and credits as part of Elms. But as far as tree planting on farmland is concerned, as a tenant, an 86 Act tenant, just remind me of the generality of needing permission or not. Does it all depend on individual tenancy agreements?
Yeah, so it will depend on individual tenancy agreements. Assuming an agreement is fully silent on the issue of whether you can plant trees or not, the legal position is so long as you don't change the character of the holding to lose its agricultural status, you can do whatever you like. So that could be, farm diversification, bed and breakfast, tree planting or whatever. So long as the holding retains its agricultural nature, its agricultural character, then you can use it for a wide range of other types of activity. However, most agreements will have some form of limitation on what the tenant can do with the holding. And quite a lot of agreements will have clauses which will say something along the lines of to use the holding for agricultural purposes only. And where those agreements will also reserve onto the landlord the trees that are on the holding and any trees that are subsequently planted on the holding. So in those circumstances, the only thing that you can use the holding for is for agricultural purposes, and you will therefore need the consent of the landlord to grow trees on that land. Now we have, as I said earlier, within the agricultural bill, the opportunity for tenants to object to a landlord who refuses you consent to do that on a reasonable basis. Now, what would be a reasonable basis? It would be unreasonable, I think, for you to take some prime arable land, which gets 10 tons of the hectare, and planted with trees willy-nilly, you know, where there's land drainage and all sorts. But it wouldn't be unreasonable if you wanted to plant up some scrubby areas or field edges or some wet areas or for screening purposes. So there are ways in which through the AHA agreements we can foresee tenants being able to plant trees. And the other one, which is gaining in importance, is agroforestry, where the trees are actually ancillary to the agricultural use of the holding, which would be considered an agricultural use, and therefore that's something that some tenants are looking at as a possibility going forward. So in general terms, most tenants will need the consent of their landlords. Some tenants won't because of the nature of their agreements.
Interesting, yeah. And the point about delinking of support, and in particular being able to claim BPS based on entitlements, and perhaps being able to upfront claim BPS is in order to aid retirement, which I think is the original scheme that sort of has been around in the CAP and certain other countries and member states, but not ours for some time, and been quite successful. And if we're seeing a transition in the industry now around generational change, income change, and various other things around holdings, if we are to see the opportunity to claim the outstanding BPS claims from now to 27 over in a single claim in order to aid that process, what's your thinking on how that's going to sit with AHA, is particularly because FBT is largely, as you say, will have some sort of clause and restriction, won't they? But AHAs may well be silent, largely would have been silent because they've been in existence long before IACs came along. But is that not a sort of recipe for a bit of a bum fight?
Well, what I think we're disappointed about is that the original intention of the lump sum scheme was threefold. It was either to provide opportunities for people to exit the industry, or provide a lump sum of money for them to invest in their farm business in some way, fixed equipment or diversification activity, or to invest off the holding. And now DEFRA has decided, for various reasons, one of which is their concerns about their ability to get people to cross-comply when they're not applying for an annual payment, and one because they're worried about creating too much of a spike in demand for a lump sum payment in 1 year. They are now deciding to limit it to retirement only. The other concerns that we have is to what extent they're going to limit the ability to take a payment. So they're already talking about applying a cap to the level of the lump sum payment. So they have talked in the past about £100,000 as the cap for that, or even lower. And they're talking about maybe not introducing it at the beginning, but maybe 2 or 3 years into the transition period. So the more that they seek to apply restrictions, the less valuable it is to the tenant. But we think for those AHA tenants who are in a position of looking at potential exit, that the lump sum payment could offer an important part of a portfolio of retirement options. So as I said in my presentation, tenant farmers could potentially argue or negotiate a surrender package from the landlord for the tenancy. They will also have their live and dead stock on the holding as well, maybe some tenants improvements. So add those two things to a lump sum payment, it starts to make sense for people to be able to consider retirement in that scenario. So I don't think it's going to be as big a bun fight as you might have thought, Charles, given the way in which DEFRA is now restricting its usefulness. But I think it could be a really important door opener for many people who are considering the possibility of retirement and should aid some restructuring.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't appreciated that DEFRA was sort of whittling it down. I was somewhat sceptical of whether it'll ever arrive, but I didn't know that there'd been some whittling down of it. I see there's quite an interesting question being asked on the chat, Greg. I don't know if you want to just address that, so we can.
Yeah, what I was going to do, if I ask this question, Charles, and then if you have a chance to ask one final question, then we'll move into the last part of the webinar, if that's okay. So, so a question from Angus is, if one took a lump sum and ceased claiming BPS, this is for you, George, sorry, took a lump sum and ceased claiming BPS, how would 86 Act rents be calculated?
Okay, so the way in which you look at an 86 Act rent is to disregard the fact that the tenant is an occupation of the holding. So you've got to disregard the individual circumstances of that particular tenant farmer, and you've got to assess the rent on the basis of what a hypothetical prudent and willing tenant would be prepared to pay to a prudent and willing landlord, taking into consideration all relevant factors, and in every case, the terms of the tenancy being offered, the character and situation of the holding, the productive capacity of that holding, and its related earning capacity in the hands of a tenant competently farming it, and rents being paid on comparable holdings. So the fact that the sitting tenant has taken a lump sum payment from the BPS entitlement scheme is irrelevant in relation to the specific rent review on that holding, because you've got to look at it on the basis of that tenant not being an occupation. You've got to do it on the basis of what would the hypothetical tenant looking over the hedge think about that holding. And that's exactly the same situation as applies now. So you could be the best sheep farmer in the country, and you make, you know, those tables that you showed earlier, you could be in the top 5% of sheep farms in the country, but your rent will be based on the average sheep farmer in the country, because the landlord shouldn't benefit from the fact that you are the best sheep farmer in the country. Equally, if you're the worst sheep farmer in the country, if you're in the bottom 5% of that schema, the landlord shouldn't have to accept a lower rent from you because you happen to be an awful sheep farmer. So you're assessed against the average level of rents that would be paid by a hypothetical tenant. So that's quite a long way of saying the fact that you've taken the Queen shilling in a BPS scheme would be irrelevant to your individual circumstances, because you've got to look at the basis of the hypothetical tenant.
Right. Thanks, George. That's a very, very full answer. And I hope any sheep farmers who are listening have taken note. Charles, do you have a last question for George?
I do. Can I just go back to that answer you've just given, George, as well, to make sure I've understood that correctly? Because it's the hypothetical tenant that we're looking at, is it not, as you just said?
Yep.
But the hypothetical tenant will take into fact the earning capacity of the subject holding, won't he? And if if the subject holding has no entitlements, because in our existing understanding of the sport regime, that earning capacity is going to be diminished, isn't it?
Well, what I would question there, Charles, is that currently no holdings have entitlements, because entitlements are held by individuals, and they bring those entitlements to the party to match with land that is eligible to be brought into the scheme. So what the rent review process under the AHA provision seeks to answer the question about is, who is out there and what do they bring to the party? Have they got entitlements that they would bring? Now, if you're looking at a 200-acre holding, you might say, well, there'll be plenty of people out there with a couple of hundred entitlements that they might be willing to bring to the party to rent against this land. If you're talking about a holding of 1,000 acres, it might be very different for someone to have the available entitlements to farm that holding. Equally, if we have a situation where thousands of people cash in their entitlements so that they take a lump sum payment from the government, then actually the population of hypothetical tenants is going to be without entitlements in large part. So then you begin to see the impact on individual levels of rent, because the the cohort of tenants are without those entitlements going forward. So at a certain level, that the loss of entitlements will have an impact on rents, but not at the margin.
Okay, that could be quite interesting in the next few years if there's an opportunity to take entitlements from holdings, I guess. The last point I was going to just ask about is this whole term of tenancies, because again, over the last, well, since 95 Act, I suppose, we've seen in the main, I would say, relatively short term of FBTs. And as you said, I think in your presentation, and I completely agree, we're going through a period of uncertainty, significant change, maybe some more or longer term land uses as well, possibly, depending on what comes under ELMS. Obviously, we're seeing mid-tier stewardship and how that looks for its 5-year duration. But I think lots of people would be better off, but on both sides of the fence, if we could foresee a situation where perhaps longer term tenancies were back as part of regular offering for all sorts of reasons, building futures, tenants investing in fixed equipment to improve the earning capacity for them and their landlord, and maybe joint investments between landlords and tenants. That's we haven't seen a great deal of for some time. Is there anything there's nothing in the legislation that's being proposed that's going to encourage that specifically? I guess it's just market forces, again, supply and demand, that are going to encourage that. If I'm right in foreseeing that we might see circumstances where that's slightly more applicable as far as the offer is concerned from landlords.
Yeah, so there's nothing specifically in the package of stuff in the Ag Bill. The Tenancy Reform Industry Group did look at the possibility of giving landlords who let longer, easier to use opportunities to take land back for things like planning, consent, or for situations where tenants were in breach to try and encourage longer term tenancies. That yet might come forward. But you're right, Charles, the average length of term on an FBT is now 3 years, which is ridiculous. 90% of all farm tenancies are let for 5 years or less. So it's only a very small proportion get those longer agreements. I mean, even with the house and buildings and land, we're looking at average length of term of 6 or 7 years. And we have been strong advocates of the government looking at the taxation framework within which landlords make decisions about letting land. So why should a landlord who is getting 100% relief from inheritance tax not be asked to do more in terms of the length of tenancy that they're offering? So we're suggesting, for example, that a landlord should only have access to the inheritance tax relief if he's prepared to let for 10 years or more. What we also say is that a landlord should be able to lock in the capital taxation position on day one of the lease. So we understand there's a bit of a concern about landlords letting a long-term lease and then suddenly finding on year 4 that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has changed the capital basis of their taxation. But we are saying that so long as the relief is available, let the landlord lock it in on day one, but encourage them for a longer term at first instance to get those longer leases in place. And in Ireland, they've been looking at the income tax incentives to encourage longer lets in Ireland, which seems to be working. So we are absolutely on the lobbying front in terms of trying to get those longer terms to the taxation framework.